All right. We are going to go ahead and get started. So welcome everyone to the third annual Work Plus Fall Conference. It's funny saying that because I feel like it was just our very first one. My name is Scott Travis. I'm the program director for Work Plus. Very excited to welcome all of our working learners, our supervisors, and other staff that are joining us today. I know we have students and staff joining us from multiple campuses, so welcome. I think that's kind of the beauty of having this as a virtual conference. We have representation from all over, including I wanted to give a special shout out to our friends in Lake Havasu that are joining us at the ASU location there. And in fact, I'm actually joining everybody from Savannah, Georgia right now, where I'm attending the National Student Employment Association's National Conference. It's been really interesting hearing about some of the innovative work other institutions are doing, but more importantly, being able to share the great work that you all, our working learners and our supervisors, are doing at ASU. So with that being said, I'm really excited about the conference today. I'm going to kick it over to our MC for the conference, and that's our Work Plus Coordinator Senior, Abby Anderson.
Thanks, Scott. Hi, everyone. Welcome. Like Scott said, I'm so excited to have you all here with us today. I can't wrap my head around the fact that we're already in November, but we do have a very full agenda for the next hour and a half. Today, we do have joining us as our keynote speaker, Jonathan Adler. Jonathan is a professor of psychology at Olin College of Engineering and a senior lecturer at Harvard Medical School. He'll be speaking to us about the power of personal stories in your career journey. After Jonathan's session, we will also be hearing from a couple employers. We'll have an employer Q&A. Employers are featuring Dan Wilson, Communication Director for the City of Phoenix, and Tiffany Bellows, who is Workforce Stability Leader at Boeing Company. Before we get started, though, I wanted to talk about the Work Plus Fall Conference Workbook. Some of you may already have these in hand, but for those of you who did not receive one, do not worry. We will be sharing a link to a digital version in the chat for you to utilize and follow along, fill out. This workbook is yours to use as you please as we go through the conference. You don't have to turn it into us. But I do want to highlight that this workbook was designed by our own working learners here at the Work Plus office. Of course, a goal of Work Plus is to really highlight and recognize the amazing work that our working learners do. Quick plug, you'll notice on the back of the workbook is a tag, just really noting that this project was completed by working learners. This is a resource that we have created for all working learners across every department here at ASU that you can access from the Work Plus Supervisor Hub. Moving on with the program, though, again, I am very excited to introduce Jonathan Adler. As I mentioned before, he's both a professor of psychology at Olin College of Engineering, as well as a senior lecturer at Harvard Medical School. He is also the Chief Administrative Officer of Health Story Collaborative and the editor of Personality and Social Psychology Review. Additionally, he has served multiple roles for the Association for Research in Personality and the Society for Personality and Social Psychology, and is a licensed psychologist. Jonathan does have a presentation prepared for us. After his presentation, we will have some time to ask questions that you may have. So again, I really encourage you all to utilize the Q&A option there for questions that you have for Jonathan. With that being said, Jonathan, I'll let you take it away.
All right, thank you so much. Let me bring up my set of slides. All right. Well, hello, everyone. It is such a treat to get to be with you. I really appreciate the invitation, and I'm looking forward to sharing a little information about how you might think about your own personal story in your career and, more importantly, your life journeys. So the work that I'm going to talk about today, oops, got to click on the screen. All right. Really focuses on the science of stories. And I have picked this particular image for a very particular reason, which is that in the doing the science of stories always feels like walking a tightrope to a little bit. On the one hand, we really want to marshal the tools of science to say generalizable things that are useful to everyone. And at the same time, because we're really interested in people's individual stories, we really want to be able to attend to the rich complexity of each individual life. So in the work that I'm going to be telling you about, I'm not going to get down into the weeds of specific studies. I'm going to give you the general ideas that have emerged from a whole field of research. And in this field, we sort of walk this line where we're really paying close attention to individual stories while we're also trying to look for generalizable insights using the tools of science. So I thought I would start with the big question, which is why narrative? Why is this the thing that we're paying attention to? Why are stories important to us? And I want to give you sort of a collection of arguments about why narrative matters. So I'm going to start with sort of the grand theory of evolution. For many years now, scientists working in a variety of fields have suggested that narrative is the human adaptation. This is the tool that our species has evolved for navigating our very complex social arrangement as a species. And there's a wonderful philosopher named Daniel Dennett who writes about this, and he says, you know, beavers build dams and snails extrude shells and spiders spin webs and bowerbirds build bowers. He's very interested in bowerbirds. And humans tell stories. This is the thing that we do. And it turns out that stories are a really efficient and effective way of navigating the human social niche. So from the grand theory of evolution, we have this understanding of humans as natural storytellers. Indeed, the famous evolutionary biologist Stephen Jay Gould defines humans as primates who tell stories. Okay. If we go from the high theoretical down to just the very mundane, if you just watch people doing what they do, it turns out that they're telling stories. So there are studies where they ask people, you know, what's the most important thing that happened to you today? So not, you know, the grand high and low points of your life, but what happened to you today? And have you told anyone about it? And it turns out that the majority of people have told a story about the most important thing that happened to them that day. They've told that story to someone else by the end of the day. This is just the thing that we do as we go about doing our lives. There's good reason for that. It turns out that the human brain is really wired for storytelling. So when we think about all the psychological functions of the brain, the most basic psychological function is the translation of what's called sensation into perception. So sensation is the wavelengths of light hitting your retina, and perception is what your brain does with that information. And even at that most basic level, we're weaving little stories. So I'll give you a couple of examples. I assume you have no trouble reading these two lines of text, but if you look carefully, the B and the 13 are identical, right? So exactly the same wavelengths of light hit your retina, but because they're couched in these little beginning, middle, and ends, we have no trouble taking exactly the same information and different meaning. There's another example. I assume you have no trouble seeing the white triangle, even though you know it's not really there. We're doing that in the translation of sensation to perception. But if you also think about it sort of metaphorically, it's what we're doing all the time. There's stuff that happens objectively out in the world, and our brain is always making sense of it by weaving it into these coherent stories about our lives. That happens at the most basic perceptual level. Of course, it happens at a much more sophisticated psychological level when we think about our identity. So in addition to sort of the brain wiring reasons, I always like to also elevate the ethical reasons for focusing on people's stories. A lot of social science, including psychology, is very top-down, where researchers have ideas and they formulate their hypotheses and they go out and test them. And narrative approaches to psychology tend to be very bottom-up. We treat people as the experts on their own experiences, and we sort of say, you know, tell me your story, and we'll figure out what's going on in your story. So the ethical orientation to studying people's narratives is very aligned with my, you know, sort of philosophy of how science ought to operate. It's certainly one of the main reasons that I went into the field. And then if you are one of these people who says, you know, I don't care about all those theories, show me the data, I can show you the data. So this is a study that's a few years old now, 2016, but some colleagues and I pulled together every study that has ever compared narrative variables with other kinds of psychological variables. So things like our demographic characteristics, our basic personality traits, things like that, as they relate to our psychological well-being. And we find over and over that the stories that we tell about our lives are better predictors of our well-being than these other variables. The technical term for that is incremental validity. The stories that we tell explain above and beyond these other variables. So even if the theory stuff doesn't persuade you and you just want to see the data also say that our stories are really important. All right, so what ends up in our stories? It turns out it's not everything. We don't go around storying every piece of our experience. So the sort of grandfather of this field, Jerome Bruner, said it was deviations from the canonical. And what he meant by that is it's the things that are different. So the canon is sort of the things that happen all the time. And he was clear to point out that deviations can either be objective facts or the subjective meaning. So like if you had Cheerios for breakfast today, you're probably not going to tell someone a story about that. But if you got poisoned by your Cheerios, you probably are going to tell a story about that. Or likewise, if you had some like really important conversation with someone over Cheerios this morning, you're probably going to tell that story too. So the everyday things tend to recede, and it is the deviations that we end up telling stories about. And we as a species go about creating these deviations on purpose. So there's a whole psychology of vacations. It turns out that we have more memories from when we're on vacation than we do from the same chunk of time in our everyday life. And that's because on vacation, everything is a deviation from the canonical. So, you know, if you go away, then like where the spoons are is a deviation. And even if you don't go away, just doing things out of the, you know, your daily rhythms carves out that vacation time as separate. Likewise, psychotherapy by definition is a deviation. We sort of carve out this space that is separate from our everyday lives so that we can step back and reflect on it and make sense of that. Deviations aren't just things that we seek out, they also happen to us. So I do a lot of work with stories of illness, and you know, people do not rehearse a story of, you know, I graduated from college and then I got cancer. That's not a story people practice. So illness is very often something we have to make sense of. But these things don't have to be negative. Serendipity, you know, wonderful, unexpected things also happen to us, and we tend to tell those. So we think about this collection of deviations as sort of the high points, the low points, and the turning points in our lives. And when we look back over our whole life, all the way back into our childhood, up to the present, but also into the future as we imagine it, we call this whole collection of stories narrative identity. So narrative identity is the internalized, the story first we tell to ourselves, evolving story of the self, and it weaves together the reconstructed past, the perceived present, and the imagined future. Those modifiers are really important, as I'll talk about in a few minutes. We know from research on our memory that we're not particularly great at holding on to the objective experiences of our lives. We're always making sense of it. We're always reconstructing the past, perceiving the present, and imagining the future. And narrative identity is the story that sort of weaves all of that together. So let me talk a little bit about where narrative identity comes from in the first place. So the natural place to start is with development, right? As a species, we are not born with words, let alone stories. And so this is something we have to learn. And there are some key milestones in childhood, like the development of language, which is usually, you know, the end of the first year of life into the second year of life. Later in childhood, we develop what's called theory of mind, which is the idea that other people have different internal experiences than we do. To be able to tell a story, you got to have different characters who want different things. And so we need that. But a lot of this happens later in childhood. And one of my colleagues at Emory University, Robin Fivish, has done some fascinating work on the gendered ways in which this happens. And she finds in her studies that parents, both fathers and mothers, tend to tell their little boys stories about what happened to them. and they tell their little girls stories about how they felt about what happened to them. So they might say to their little boy, you know, at the end of the day, oh, we went to the zoo today. That was so fun. And then we came home and we had dinner and you had a bath. And they might say to their daughters, you know, oh, remember how scared you were of the tiger at the zoo? Ooh, but then you were feeling a lot better later once we got home, right? And so when children get scaffolded like this by their caregivers, they learn how to tell different kinds of stories about their lives. And when they become the narrators of their own lives, they've learned different ingredients that go into those stories. So my husband and I have little kids, a boy and a girl, and thanks to Robin's research, I'm really careful when we're putting them to bed to say to both of them, you know, oh, we went to the zoo today, we saw the tigers, you were so scared, right? So I want them to have as large a narrative toolbox as possible. And indeed, adolescence and early adulthood, so the age that many of you, but I'm sure not all of you, are in right now, is the moment when all of this comes together. We talk about laying down the first draft of narrative identity in adolescence and early adulthood. And there are good reasons for that. So first is just the biological transformation of the body asks questions about how are you the same person that you were before, even though you look so different, right? There's a way in which our body asks that question for the first time. Second is that it just takes a lot of cognitive skill. Being able to integrate your life into one story is a fairly sophisticated cognitive task, and a lot of cognitive maturation happens during this period. And then the third is social expectation. So, you know, we might ask a 5-year-old, what do you want to be when you grow up? But we don't expect them to mean it. But by adolescence and early adulthood, we do expect people to start to be able to tell a story about how the person they've been relates to the person who they are now and who they want to be in the future. So we talk about adolescence and early adulthood as this moment when these three forces, biological transformation, cognitive maturation, and social expectation all sort of converge to kick off this project of narrative identity, which we then do for the rest of our lives. So that's the developmental perspective. As I alluded to earlier, memory, and especially autobiographical memory, so memory about the self, plays a key role here. And as I mentioned, our memories are actually not great. For a long time, that fact really bothered cognitive scientists. Why would we have this big cognitive tool that's not very accurate? And it turns out that in the last 10 or so years, there's been sort of a revolution in the cognitive science to realize that this slipperiness of memory is actually there by design. So when you think about why do we have memory in the first place, if you think about it from an evolutionary perspective, if you walk by a cave and a bear jumps out at you, you don't necessarily need to remember that cave and that bear. You need to remember that dark places might hide danger. That's going to be much more adaptive for you. And so it turns out that being able to remember the gist of our experiences is much more useful to us than if we could remember every specific detail. Indeed, the reason we have memory is not just to hold on to the past. It's to make sense of the present and anticipate the future. And the present and the future are never an exact replica of the past. So if we could only hold on to the past exactly as it happened, it actually wouldn't be that useful to us. So that's the memory piece. And then, of course, the other important thing is that we're not islands. We exist in a rich narrative ecosystem, right? There are stories told about us from before we are born, and there's all kinds of stories that circulate in our culture. And some of those stories are incredibly powerful. We call these master narratives. These are narratives that are often invisible, but they're ubiquitous, they're everywhere, and they exert a lot of power. So there are national master narratives. There are, narratives of what it means to be an American. There are narratives about different racial or gender categories. There are narratives about different fields, et cetera, et cetera. There are lots of master narratives, and we're always negotiating our own personal stories in dialogue with these stories that are in the culture. So narrative psychologists talk about narrative as the nexus of self and society, that in many ways society is a collection of stories, and our own identity is a collection of stories. And those two stories are always in dialogue with each other. Okay, so we've talked a little bit about why narrative matters and where narrative comes from. Now I want to talk about why our stories matter for ourselves, for our own, development and well-being. So I sort of play this out as a conversation in my mind. So I figured that's just how I would do it on the slides. So you asked this question, okay, why do stories matter? Well, the literature on narrative identity suggests that narrative identity serves two primary functions, unity and purpose. So unity is so you feel like you are the same person from moment to moment. And purpose is our stories also tell us why we do what we do, why it matters to us. So then you might ask, okay, well, why do unity and purpose matter? And the answer there is that they are the basis of our mental health. When we feel like we are the same person over time, when we feel like we know why we're doing what we're doing with our lives, then we feel good. But I want to drill down just a little bit on that and talk about what we mean when we say mental health. So when you look at the broad psychological literature on well-being, there's actually sort of two big domains of our mental health. And they get these sort of like cumbersome names from Aristotle. So they're called hedonic and eudaimonic well-being. So hedonic well-being means it feels good. Eudaimonic well-being might not feel so good, but it means that things feel meaningful. So then, of course, you ask, okay, well, how do our stories get us there? How do our stories get us to these two kinds of well-being? And it turns out that it is the themes in our stories, not the content. So the specific content of what happened in your life is what it is, but the way you tell the story about what happened seems to be the key thing when it comes to supporting our well-being. So there are lots of themes that have been studied over the years, and I'm going to just give you like a little smattering of some of the key themes that show up again and again in the literature. And I'm going to sort of cluster them into a few different categories to make it easier to hold on to. So the first category of themes are motivational themes. All stories are about a character trying to do something. And the sort of signature motivational themes are called agency and communion. So agency is the way you portray the main character in the story, who's you. And is that main character sort of in the driver's seat of their life, or they're being batted around by the whims of external forces? And these are stories. These are themes and stories. No one is completely in control of their lives. So this is really about how you choose to tell the story. And stories that are high in agency tend to better support our well-being. But like I said before, no person is an island. All stories are about characters in relationship with other characters. And of course, we know that the quality of those relationships matters a lot. So that theme we call communion. Again, communion is sort of, are the relationships in your life sort of reciprocal and nurturing and loving and kind, or you're more isolated, disconnected, rejected? And again, we all have relationships with huge variety of qualities, so this is how you choose to tell the story. And as you can imagine, stories with higher levels of communion tend to go along with better psychological well-being. All right, the next category of themes are affective themes. Emotion is a really important feature of our brain, and so all stories have emotions in them. And while it turns out that, yeah, happy stories tend to be good for you, and sad stories don't feel so good, it's actually how we weave together the changes in our emotions that seems to be most important. So here the signature themes are called redemption and contamination. So redemption stories are stories that start bad and end good, and contamination stories start good and end bad. Okay, all lives have good and bad in them. So these sequences are really about where you draw the chapter breaks of your life, where you draw connections between things. And redemption stories that start bad and end good tend to be very good for us. And contamination stories where everything good ends bad, that tends to be not so good for our well-being. The next category of themes is called themes of integrative meaning. And here we're looking at the ways in which people go about the process of making meaning of their lives. I'll explain that in a minute. So the sort of key themes here are called assimilative and accommodative processing. So most of what we do most of the day is called assimilative processing. New things happen, and we just weave that into the story that we've been telling about our lives. We just assimilate it. And sometimes even big life changes just get assimilated, right? So starting a job might be the next chapter in a story of your work life up to that point. But sometimes things happen that really don't fit with the story we've been telling about our lives. They might call that story into question. They might really undermine the way we've been telling our stories. And in those instances, we have to do the hard work of changing the story to accommodate these new experiences. And so accommodative processing is hard work, but it tends to be quite good for our well-being on the other side. And then the last set of themes I want to tell you about are structural aspects. So this is really sort of the mechanics of how you put your story together. And here, rather than a pair of themes, we're really interested in the sort of overall coherence of your story. And when we're talking about narrative identity, we're talking about more than just, can I follow the story? Is it coherent in that way? We mean, like, are you including temporal details? Like, do I know when this low point or high point or turning point happened to you? What's the psychological context? How are you feeling? How did it change how you were feeling? And then also your interpretation. Now that you've told me this story, why? What does this story mean to you? Why did you single this out as your low point or your high point or your turning point? That kind of thing. And when we get higher levels of coherence, that tends to go along with better psychological well-being. Now, there are lots more themes than the ones that I've told you about today. I wanted to give you sort of a little flavor for them, but these are some of the signature themes. So let me talk to you about how we get from these themes to our well-being. So remember, there are these two broad domains of well-being called hedonic and eudaimonic. Hedonic means it feels good. Eudaimonic means it feels meaningful. Well, it turns out that there are sort of different pathways by which our stories get us there. So when our stories are high in agency and communion, when they have redemption and not contamination, when they're coherent, that tends to feel good. But when we do sort of a deep exploration, when we're engaged in an active search for meaning making, especially in the face of challenging things, what we call accommodative processing, that gives our lives a sense of meaningfulness, this eudaimonia. It doesn't always feel good. And sometimes in the face of really challenging things, feeling good is not always an option to us. But we can really engage in this process of searching for meaning, and that's going to do meaningful things for us as well. And then, of course, in an ideal scenario, we can do all of these things. We can get both hedonic and eudaimonic well-being. So our stories have different functions for us in supporting our well-being. So first and most straightforwardly, they act as this structure for holding on to our past. The narrative identity is like the architecture or the infrastructure of our identity. And again, it is just a story, so it can be revised, but just like, remodeling a building or moving a highway, it's not that those are not possible, but they take work. So we really need to be mindful of the kinds of stories that we tell about our past. We also use our stories as a foundation for making meaning of new experiences. So often when new things happen to us, we filter them through the stories that we've been telling about our lives, and lend the same kinds of narrative themes and structures to the stories of the new events. So again, we want to think about our stories not just as a way of holding on to what happened to us, but also as this tool that we can use for making sense of the things that happen to us going forward. Now, a while back, I got sort of obsessed with the question about this relationship between the stories that we tell about our lives and our well-being, and wondering which comes first. And what I have found is that the stories themselves actually change before our well-being changes. So for example, in one study that I did, we enrolled a bunch of people. These are people who had contacted a major outpatient psychotherapy clinic. They contacted the clinic. These were all adults. They said, I'd like to see a therapist, and we got their stories. Then they started working with a therapist, and at every session, they would fill out sort of standardized measures of well-being, and they'd also share their stories. And when we looked at the trajectory of their well-being over the course of treatment, alongside the trajectory of their stories, we found that first, people got better over the course of treatment, which is good because decades of psychotherapy research suggests that it works. And we found that their stories changed. But when we looked at the slope of those changes, we actually found that their stories changed before their mental health changed and not the other way around. So we titled that study Living into the Story, because it was as though people put out sort of a new, different kind of version of their lives. And then a week or two later, their mental health sort of caught up with it. So I'm going to wrap up in a minute, and I'd love to take your questions. So please feel free to put those into the Q&A, and we'll have time, definitely have time to do that. But of course, I've been talking very broadly about life stories, and since this is Work Plus, I want to drill down and connect it specifically to career journeys. And I think of career journeys as sort of one thread in our broader narrative identity. There are all kinds of pieces of our identity that don't necessarily touch on our work, but work can sometimes be a very important part of our narrative identity. And so I want us to think about that contextualized part of our stories. I think the most important thing to know is that you are not only the main character in your life story, you're also the narrator. So we play these dual roles. Growing up, we as children, we are often characters in a story that is narrated for us. We don't have the cognitive sophistication to be able to do this narration on our own. But in adolescence and early adulthood, we develop that ability and we become the narrators. Now, we're not narrators from a blank slate. We've inherited all the stories and the thematic ways in which people have narrated our lives for us. But this is an opportunity to become aware of that dual role, think about the story of you that you've inherited, and think about whether you're happy with that story or you want to make some revisions to it now that you really are the narrator. And of course, I want you to remember that the way you narrate your life really does matter for your well-being. So it's not just, this fluffy thing like, oh, let me tell a story to someone else. No, this is the foundation of our identity. And decades now of research suggest that the way you tell that story really is going to matter. It's something that's worth your time. I'm going to wrap up now, but your career story, like I said, is sort of one thread in the broader story of your life. So I want you to ask yourself what role you want your career story to play. There's research that shows that the more differentiated our sense of self is, the more sort of buffered we are against bad things that happen. And that makes sense. If your career is your whole life and then something bad happens, you've sort of only got one bin for your self-esteem and your well-being. If you've got a career story and a relationship story and a mentorship story and all other kinds of stories, a parenting story, a religious story, a civic engagement kind of story, then you've got lots of different threads to weave together. And if something happens in one domain, it might not threaten your sort of overall well-being in the same way as it would. So there's nothing wrong with a life story that is heavily dominated by one domain like career. But I want you to think really carefully about how you're telling that story and approach it with some intentionality going forward about how you want that story to unfold. So I'm going to wrap up there, and I hope that I have spurred some questions for you. I would love to hear those, and I'm really, really looking forward to hearing what you have to say.
Well, thank you so much, Jonathan. That was wonderful. One thing immediately that I was like, wow, why did I not think of it in that way? Was the fact that the way I tell my story is then going to affect my well-being and how I feel about myself, the work I'm doing, that kind of thing. Again, one of those that, as you said it, I was like, well, yeah, duh, but I've never put two and two together like that. So greatly appreciate.
Oh,
that.
I'm so glad. And it's important to know you're also sort of a co-narrator with the other important people in your life, right? So you're telling stories about you. That's really going to matter. But you're also helping shape the stories that the people that matter to you tell about their own lives, right? They're going to tell you stories. You're going to give them feedback on those stories, even if it's nonverbal or unconscious feedback. And that's going to really matter as they continue to shape and revise their own stories.
Absolutely. We are starting to get some questions in the Q&A. So just again, I know Jonathan mentioned it, but if you guys do have any questions, please feel free to add them there. One question that I keep getting though, Jonathan, is can we have access to the slide deck?
Oh, sure. Happy to.
I know this session is being recorded. Of course, everybody will have access to the recording, but if we could also have access to the slides, that would be great, Jonathan.
Sure.
Another question here, how can you optimize each domain that you choose to include into your life story or your experiences if you spread yourself thin and focus on many?
Well, so optimization is an interesting word, right? I that makes a lot of sense in certain kinds of work contexts, but I don't think about identity as something that you want to optimize. Identity is going to be this tool that has to serve a lot of purposes for you over the course of your life, and pushing it, optimizing it in one domain may actually get in the way of another domain. So for example, when we talk about agency and communion, as I've already described them, at very high levels, those can sometimes come into conflict. If you're all about agency, you're doing what's best for you, you're driving your life, that may mean that you're not attending to the relationships in your life as much as they need. And likewise, if your whole life story is about communion and it's attending to every relationship and making sure everyone's doing well and happy, well, you might not be paying enough attention to your own needs. So I really think of these stories as sort of fluid and elastic over the course of your life. And you're going to need to tell stories about your life in different contexts for different reasons. So I wouldn't think about it so much as optimization as much as it is, what are the functions that my story is doing in this particular context, when I'm at work, when I'm with my family or my friends, and mostly trying to be intentional about it, but also recognizing the way in which it's gonna change over time. There are really interesting studies of repeated narration where we get a story and then like 2 years later we say, hey, last time you were in the lab, you told us this story. Can you tell that story again? And some people, the stories stay very stable, and for some people, they change a lot. And that is usually about whatever's going on for them in the present moment. We're always using our past as a tool for making sense of the present.
I love that. Could you also talk to us a little bit about the importance of first impressions and how stories might play into first impressions? And then going off of that as well, how long should an ideal introduction be? I know, I think when I was in undergrad, they were telling us an elevator pitch, no more than 45 seconds. Is that still true, or what are studies kind of looking like now?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So I don't know. I mean, I do not know the science about those kinds of elevator pitches or introductions, but I love that you're making the connection between storytelling and those, because indeed that is very much what's happening there. What I do know about is that when you're trying to make a first impression, especially with someone you're trying to impress, what's really important is to go beyond the sort of summary, the bland summary. The more you can insert those introductions with specific details about your life, the more sticky they're going to be. So for example, at the college where I work, every year I run a story slam. And we do it as part of admissions. So students tell stories about their lives, and they do it as part of the big admissions event. And we work with students, and often they want to tell stories about, like, I had this great success on a team that I was working on, or, this project. And those stories end up really boring. You got to get into the specificity and the granular details. So, a classic elevator pitch is like, I'm in this because I just want to help people. And that's great that you want to help people. I also want to help people. But that's not a sticky story. You need to tell us a story of a specific moment when you helped people. So I also run a workshop called Projects with Purpose, telling stories about why you do what you do. And it's funny, people often feel like, well, if I just tell about one very specific thing, then they're not going to get the full picture. And the truth is, people are actually going to hold on to your story much more if they really feel transported into one specific experience, even if that one specific experience doesn't generalize to every experience. A tiny, tight story about a specific moment that has some generalizable like moral or summary at the end, that's going to be much more compelling.
So thinking too, just with our audience and, you know, aspiring storytellers as they're getting ready to enter the workforce, what are some essential lessons that maybe you've learned from your own experiences in the field of storytelling that you could share with our students?
Yeah. So, I mean, in a way, I'm going to return to a couple things that I've said that I think are the most central. One is specificity, that as you're telling stories to other people, really leaning into the specific details. Again, people often have this internal sense of like, well, if I just tell you about one specific moment, then you're not going to get that this is generally true of me. But that's not true. People really do get that. And those individual stories are very powerful. And then the other is to approach that task with intentionality, right? To realize that the stories that you tell matter, that it's less about the content that you share and more about the way that you share it that will ultimately matter, both for you and for the people receiving those stories.
Awesome. Thank you so much. If anybody else has any other questions, feel free to continue utilizing the Q&A. But Jonathan, again, thank you so much for your time and your insights, your knowledge on the matter. Oh, it looks like I just got another one real quick.
All right.
Okay. Could you discuss the role of empathy and emotional connection in storytelling and how you've honed the ability to really connect with diverse audiences throughout your career? So again, I know you mentioned knowing the difference of if you're talking to somebody at work or if you're talking with your friends or family, yeah, just again, with the diverse audiences that you may encounter.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm going to sound like a broken record, but I really think specificity is the thing that resonates. So what you want to be able to do, no matter who you're talking to, is give them the sort of rich feel of what your life is like. And if you tell them about your life instead of transporting them into your life, you're going to be much more effective at cultivating that empathy if you give them that transport experience where it feels like, oh, I felt like I was right there with you during that experience. And then, yeah, as listeners, you also play a really important role in shaping people's stories. So not just being a good storyteller, but being a good story receiver is also a really important skill, really deeply attending and listening to other people and letting them know that you heard them and being curious and interested. Those are also ways of cultivating these deeper connections.
So, Jonathan, I know I don't think you have a workbook like in hand with you, but I know you've seen the workbook and stuff.
Yeah.
And during your session, of course, I was like going crazy in my workbook. But one of the exercises that we have in the workbook is about stories of your life. And we kind of highlight, what are important key moments in your life. And from those moments, would you say those are high points, low points, turning points?
Right.
So of course I was going through and I was adding my own, and a couple of them I was looking and I was like, well, that was a low point, but also a turning point. Is that that's a possibility, right? Like,
absolutely.
Low points are also turning points, could possibly turn into a high point, I'm sure.
Absolutely. And indeed, sometimes themes like redemption do exactly that. They turn a low point into a high point or into a turning point. So yeah, those are sort of broad categories to think about the big moments in your life: low points, high points, and turning points. But our memory, like I said, is always up. It's always up for revision. So stories that at one moment are a low point can later become a turning point or even a high point.
And there was something else you said. My notes are literally just all over the place. But, oh, just the fact like who I was, who I am now, and who I want to be, that could all change too. Again, with my well-being and where I'm at mentally is going to affect who I want to be tomorrow, right? So I think that's just, again, something to know. I know I hear it all the time too, like you said, asking 5-year-olds, what do you want to be when you grow up? And I talk with students on the daily about, well, when I was going through school, high school, I was dead set. I wanted to be a special education teacher for middle school students, like dead set. I did job shadows. I knew exactly what I wanted to be. And then that threw off after taking classes and just life happening. And it's just something that, I kind of joke about with students still to this day. I'm 28 years old. I graduated with master's degrees. I still don't necessarily know what I want to be when I grow up. And that's totally fine, right?
And totally normal. I mean, all of even if you've had the most linear path in life, the story that you tell is still going to evolve. And actually, if it doesn't evolve, there's something's going on there, then you're sort of rigidly stuck in one story. So yes, our stories are there to serve a function in the present. And that present is always changing. New things are always happening to us. We expect people's life stories to change over time. And again, the important thing to remember is that you're not just the character in that story that's going on, you're also the narrator. So you have some control, even if you don't have control over the things that happen in your life, because no one has total control over the things that happen in their lives. You do have control over the story that you're telling about it.
Absolutely. Okay, Jonathan, I think we might have time for one more question. How do you stay away from oversharing, going back to the connection on the first impressions, not wanting to come off as overwhelming or that you're unloading to the person that you're telling your story to? I'm kind of laughing with that because I am one that overshares, so I can't wait to hear the answer to this.
I mean, so there are oversharing is in the eye of the beholder, right? It's like it always emerges from who you're talking to and what their tolerance for receiving your stories are. So I tend to lean towards oversharing versus undersharing, because oversharing suggests that you trust the other person to be able to receive your story. And when people hold back, that can feel disconnecting. But yes, of course, you need to pay attention to what it is you're sharing and to whom. And we're going to narrate different versions of the same experiences to ourselves versus to our most intimate, friends and partners versus to our coworkers. And that's perfectly appropriate. So while we have an internalized story of our lives, you're going to share that story in different ways with different audiences, and sort of attuning yourself to what's appropriate in any given context seems like something worth working on.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Jonathan. And again, thank you for joining us this afternoon. We greatly appreciate it. And
Really,
to the audience, again, we'll give to you Jonathan's slides in the week to come. But again, thank you so much, Jonathan.
My pleasure. Thank you so much for having me.
All righty. So again, that was awesome. I am laughing at myself with the amount of notes that I was taking throughout that session. I hope you all also enjoyed that. It looks like we do have our employers have joined us this afternoon. So we are going to get ready to have our employer Q&A. Again, much like our session just now with Jonathan, if during the conversation with our employers, you all have other questions that you would like insights from them, please utilize that Q&A option. And we will try to get those answered for you. So with that being said, I would love to introduce University College's program manager, Amy Mikolenko, who will be moderating our Q&A with our employers. Amy has worked for over 9 years here at ASU, both as a senior leader in career services and for the past year. She's been in this project management role, focusing on key strategic initiatives within University College. Over Amy's 20-year career, she has worked in government, corporate, and nonprofit sectors, primarily in the area of career services, workforce development, human resources, higher education, and nonprofit leadership. Amy is very, very passionate about supporting students to be their most successful selves as they take their next steps after graduation. So with all that, Amy, I would love to pass it over to you.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Abby. And hello to all of you out there joining us. Excited to be here today and excited to dive into the next portion of our conference, where we're going to actually be talking to two awesome employers who are going to share a bit more about storytelling, particularly in the context of that career journey, etc. So I want to quickly introduce them, and we are going to jump into some questions. I do have some set questions that we're going to talk through with our panelists. But again, as we've mentioned multiple times today, the Q&A function is open. So if you've got burning questions for our employers, drop them there, and we will make sure to get to as many of your questions as possible. So I have two folks joining me for our employer panel. The first one is Dan Wilson. Dan is the communications director for the city of Phoenix. He previously worked as a communication director, and Dan worked in 25 years as an award-winning producer in television news. So he's got a really diverse background. Interested to hear how storytelling and his story has sort of helped his path move along the different iterations of his career. So excited to hear from him. We also have Tiffany Bellows joining us as well. And Tiffany is the workforce stability leader for the Boeing company in Mesa. She's worked over 10 different positions across multiple divisions and led 3 different teams. She's also an ASU alum. Very exciting. So welcome to Tiffany and Dan. Excited to get started with our conversation today. And I'm just going to jump in with a question here. And actually, Tiffany, I'll go to you first. So tell us about, in your particular career, how has storytelling maybe played a part in your career journey?
All right, let me just find my notes. Can you hear me okay on this?
We can hear you. Yes, Tiffany. Thanks.
So let's see. Story. So I don't know if you're doing these in any order, because I have answers for all like 20 of your questions you sent. But I did want to kind of link storytelling to how we interview here at Boeing. And the more I talk to students, the more this is kind of like nerve-wracking coming straight from college, is the STAR method. So if you haven't heard of the STAR method, we do use that here specifically for, I'll call them the office jobs versus the hands-on tech jobs in an interview. And it really helps leaders gauge what type of behavior and what type of person you are, instead of just, asking a generic question. But it's how you answer a question. So it's like, tell me about a time where you XYZ. And so you're going to want to use STAR method, and the STAR stands for situation, describe a challenge, the task, what you needed to achieve, the actions you took, and the results that from the outcome of the scenario. And so it sounds very like probably, black and white and like kind of robotic, but if you really think of when you're telling a story, that's kind of setting you up for how you tell a story, right? You kind of preface the story, you talk about why the story is important, a specific example, and then what steps you took, and then what was the result. So it kind of helps you tell that story succinctly in an interview, and that really does translate your answer, right? So an experience you may have answering the question that the hiring team is looking for. So.
Great, thanks, Tiffany. I think to kind of lean back to the presentation that we just heard from Jonathan, he used that reference of making a story sticky, right? Providing, really using that method to provide those details that really give somebody insight and allows them to maybe follow along and feel like they're more part of that story, and makes it sticky, which we know, supports that connection that storytelling can breed. So, Dan, I'm going to jump over to you, and I'd love to hear from you kind of the same question. How has maybe storytelling played a part in your particular career journey?
It's an interesting question coming from the career field that I spent 25 years in as a journalist, where that's what we do, is go out and tell people's stories. But when I was thinking about my own story and how, how has that evolved and how have I don't know, embraced that. And I was thinking about, some different experiences I had. When I was a freshman in college, I knew from a young age that I wanted to be a TV journalist. I thought I wanted to be a TV news anchor. And, so I go to the freshman orientation. They give us a current events test. It's asking questions about things going on in the world in general. I'm 18 years old and I got half of the questions right. And they said, if you don't know the answers to these things, you're in the wrong place. And I changed my major because of that one experience. And I went to business, and then I became a PR major. And then I finally, toward the end of my sophomore year, found my way back to broadcasting, which I loved and I had a great career in. And, I just think for a moment, as an 18-year-old, I let someone else write my story instead of owning my story myself and really pursuing it the way that I wanted to. And the truth is, there were things I didn't know. I didn't know that I really didn't want to be a television news anchor. What I really wanted to do was lead newsrooms. I wanted to be a decision maker. I wanted to, be the person who was deciding what was going in a newscast and writing it and being engaged in the development of stories. And it just was, that has stuck with me, and I've used multiple times, especially when I'm speaking to people who are in that same age range, just to let them know you own the story. Don't let someone deter you.
An amazing point, and I think a great one to make. And I think, oftentimes as we're coming into college, there's this real expectation that you are creating quickly and or know what your story is and how it will play out. But we're expecting folks to come into college and oftentimes create their story with very limited information. And it sounds like there's this multitude of experiences that sort of happen throughout your educational journey that sort of move and shape and give you more information to sort of write that story. And that sounds like that was really the experience that you had, Dan.
Yes, and kind of a counter to that, maybe not counter, but and not a but an and to that story is when my career in broadcasting had evolved to kind of its pinnacle, and I was the news director at Arizona's Family here, Channel 3 and Channel 5. It was sort of, I had reached everything that I wanted to do in that career field, and my time there came to an end. And I kind of looked and said, what is it that I want to do? I've been doing the same thing forever. And the Phoenix Police Department called and said, hey, would you come and help us with our storytelling? And it was not at all on my radar. It was outside of sort of any expertise that I felt like I had. But I also didn't say, my story is already written and I can't do something that I didn't think. I that's not the path that I can go down. But instead I said, you know what, let me try it. Let me see if that's the next chapter of my story. And I allowed that to unfold with a lot of uncertainty, frankly. I was uncertain about my own abilities to do the job, and would it be something I like, because it was very different from what I was doing. And it turned out to be the best job I've ever had. My most favorite position was working for the Phoenix Police Department. So don't discount an opportunity for your story to take a turn that maybe you didn't anticipate.
Yeah, awesome. I love amazing advice, right? And I think that reminding us that our story is constantly being written, as we move throughout our career, probably for the entirety of your career, right? Awesome. Tiffany, I want to jump back to you because I know your role in particular with Boeing, you're in a space where oftentimes you are storytelling in order to connect folks to Boeing. and in that recruitment space. So talk to me a little bit about how you use storytelling in your day-to-day work in order to connect with folks and really share what your organization does.
Yeah, so I think the number one thing that I like to remind leadership of is what makes this job successful outside the gates is that I know pretty much everything that goes on inside the gates. I've been here for 21 years. And so when I go outside the gates and I go to high schools and colleges and I talk to students, one, I know my audience, so I know if it's a younger crowd that probably has never been on an airplane before. They don't know what Boeing is or that we're here in Mesa making helicopters. But it's really connecting what we do here to what the audience wants to hear. So, I usually have a couple charts, but I usually tell the story different every time. I talk about who we are, what our bread and butter is, but then also all the little intricacies of what we do here, the 5,000 people that make up our team, and really just the endless opportunities that once you get your foot in the door, really your career can continue to expand just like it has for me. And the reason it has without me even moving sites is because I've continued to raise my hand, join teams that really had nothing to do with my day-to-day job. I volunteered to lead projects that got me leadership exposure and just really had fun and really expanded that circle. We always talk about network, 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 and it really never sunk in, no joke, till probably 2 or 3 years ago. Then I realized it really is the network you build. And it's not always to just help you get that next job, but it's really just to continue to expand that network of people that you know, and that way you find out what they're doing and how cool is that? And it's not really advertised. And then I use all those stories and all that experience and all the little jobs that my network does, and I share that with the outside world to let students know this is the awesome things we're doing here.
Great. So I think it really illuminates, obviously, the power of storytelling in order to build connection, and how important that really is. So Dan, I'd love to tap into your experience and think about, I don't know the last time you interviewed for a job. So think about maybe one of the last times you interviewed, and can you talk to us about a story that you've maybe used in an interview scenario that you felt is really impactful? Would you be willing to share that story with us?
Yes, I'm going to turn it a little bit. I've been in a hiring position for a good chunk of my career. I've been on hiring teams, and there's one story that really sticks out to me. And we were interviewing. It was a fairly entry-level position. There was some skill set that you had to come with, but it was pretty much an entry-level position. And we were interviewing several people. And my final question to this one individual was, tell me something that would make you stand out among the many other people that were interviewing. And she kicked her shoe off and she put her foot up on the table and she said, "I have webbed feet." And it was so unique and like caught me off guard a little bit. But I hired her because she stood out. I could tell that there was something there that was going to bring an energy to our workplace. That kind of energy matched the kind of energy that we wanted. And maybe in some workplaces you would say, that's not the kind of workplace to do it. And you really have to sense, and read the room a little bit. But she showed me that she had some personality, and she did it in a way that was not outside of the realm of what we were doing. And certainly you'd want to be mature. You'd want to show that you have that you're not a child. But I do think that showing some personality helps you stand out. I had working in television news, and we're choosing people to be on the air. We call them talent. And there's so many different things that appeal to people. And I had a boss once who described somebody as mayonnaise on white bread. It'll get the job done and it will fill you up, but it doesn't taste very good. And how do we, in our own realm, stand out and not just be mayonnaise on white bread, but instead something that is energetic, something that people go, I want that person on my team. I want that energy. And that's the kind of stories that you have to think about when you're interviewing to tell that will help get that across.
Love that. Tiffany, how about you? Maybe a story that you've encountered from a candidate that you've interviewed that really made them stand out.
Well, Amy, I actually did just interview. I haven't interviewed in years. I just accepted a new position. I start next week. So I was really nervous, to be honest with you. As you kind of get higher up in your career, you start to get tapped for positions, and you kind of lose focus on, oh, I have to actually like sell myself. Um, so I will say, I say one key thing I can't really remember. It was, I feel like it's such a stressful situation. You don't really remember the specifics, but I do a really good job of preparing. It is open notes. I have notes today. And so a couple key things I'll help is I match my experiences with the job requirements. And so if it's saying, looking for something that I have recently done, then I go and find that, or try to recollect some project I led that ties to that. And I write that scenario down, and it just kind of gets my brain going about, what was the story, right? What was the situation? And I kind of write it out. It helps with when I write in the little star format. So that way, when they ask the question, I'm already in that thought process to tell that story. But another key is if, I interviewed for a position that's similar to mine now. If I would have interviewed, say, for a finance position, and I haven't been in finance for, I'm going to say 5 years, I probably wouldn't want to use any examples or stories of projects I've just recently led. I probably would want to jump back to my finance days and tell stories and, scenarios from my finance job, right? So I think that just making sure that the stories you're telling pertain to what they're looking for, right? Dan was looking for someone pretty creative. So not only reading the room, but reading the job rec. And, I think for entry level, you're probably going to have to pull on transferable skills. And then as you move up in your career and you start applying for mid-level, you already have experiences of things that they're looking for. So it gets easier, but I know it's harder in the beginning when you haven't done the job yet, and you need to pull on transferable skills and tell that story about what kind of employee you were, what kind of teammate you were, what kind of project lead you were, to show that you can do the job. And then as you move up, it's already showing I've done the job before.
I think you bring up an interesting point that I wanted to sort of pick your brain, both of you, on. So Dan, we'll maybe start with you, but Tiffany, you talked about yourself personally recently going through an interviewing process and really taking the time to go through that job description, look at what they were asking for, and really consider how you could pull experiences and stories from your background that sort of match that up. So like you said, you were really prepared. When they asked you those questions, you could sort of file back to those experiences and those examples that you thought of. I'm interested to hear from you all. Where are places that people can pull stories from? Oftentimes, the students that we're working with are fairly new professionals. They might not have as extensive work experience as the both of you, and maybe don't have those specific job experiences necessarily to pull from. So where are maybe some other places that you can pull experiences and stories to really sell yourself and really give people better insight into who you are? So Dan, I'll maybe shoot this one to you first.
Really, you should be able to pull from just about anything in your life, right? There are experiences, what they're looking for, as a hiring manager, what I'm looking for is, do you have critical thinking skills and work ethic and, these attributes that I can't teach, especially if I'm hiring for an entry-level position. I know that that you don't have the skill set. You're coming into an entry-level position. And so I don't expect you to be able to do the job that we're doing, but I want to know that you can learn it. And I want to know that you're not going to be high maintenance, that you're going to work hard, you're going to be an investment for us in the future. You know, that I'm hopefully getting somebody who can grow with the company, who has desires to grow, and is ambitious. And so, you know, looking at your life experiences, I don't know that in you know, if you're graduating from college, that you want to spend too much time talking about, you know, when you were, you know, the student body president of your high school. You know, I think you'd want to look for more recent experiences than that. But certainly in, you know, a project that you did and how you tackled the project and how you worked with others, you know, something that shows that critical thinking and how you examine from multiple different ways to get the desired outcome. You know, I think too often we think with blinders on too much about the hiring process is an emotional human connection process, much more than it is a ability to do the job. I've seen multiple times where people who were more capable didn't get the job because they didn't know how to connect, and someone who did. And frankly, I've seen people who are more effective, especially as you get into leadership, they're more effective because they understand that communication with people, get more done because they connect.
Yeah,
Yeah, and
love
I'd just like to add that it's all in the personality, right? I mean, you know, Dan's probably going to be looking for someone that's outgoing, comfortable speaking in front of a couple people, maybe standing up and presenting. I know I was not the best of that when I came out of college. I think I had to present to 500 people a training when I first started here, and I almost cried in front of everyone. It definitely takes skill, but it's all in like the matching. And Dan hit the nail on the head. Like, can you show up on time? Are you not going to be high maintenance? Are you going to be on your phone all the time? Are you willing to learn? And so really opportunities are everywhere, Amy, but it's what are you doing to set yourself apart from your peers? Because your competition is everyone sitting in class with you right now. So, you know, maybe it's a club or a job or a volunteer. I mean, I volunteered so much through high school and college, and that really teaches you a lot. And it shows to an employer. You showed up and you didn't even get paid for it, but you showed up and you did a great job, and you did it over and over and over. So those are some ideas.
Yeah, I love that. I think it's important to recognize that experiences are valuable and can come from all different places, right? And thinking about those additional experiences that you're having that may be, you know, outside of like a formalized work situation can be really valuable to tell your story and connect to what makes you really valuable to that role or that organization. So thank you for that. We do have a question that came into the Q&A.
Can I just interrupt real quick? Oh, I was going to do the same thing. I say in the Q&A right now, there's a question about this, and I think what you said already relates to it. But in my own experience, when I left television news and I back to the networking thing, that I applied for 50 or 100 jobs and heard back from like 2 of them. But the job that I ended up getting at the police department was because I knew somebody who called and said, "Hey, I hear you're looking for work." And that's how I got the interview. But in the interview, so I'm interviewing for this director of communications in the police department. I've never done anything with police. I've never been covered law enforcement or whatnot as a beat reporter or anything. And they're asking me some questions. What would you do in this situation? And these were not situations that I had ever myself encountered. But I was able to say, okay, I've never been in that position. However, my experience as a leader in the past or my experience as a communicator in the past would tell me that I should get everybody in the room together and we should talk about and figure this out, or, you know, whatever the situation. And that resonated with them. They were fine. They understood that I didn't know exactly that job. But when I was able to say, well, here's how my previous experience would help with that, and here's what I would do based on the general skills that I've learned. I think that we don't think enough about how transferable our skills are. And, you know, customer service, you know, working at Taco Bell translates into ability to work with difficult people, you know, high maintenance customer, whatever. And you can talk about and transfer those skills into the new job that you're applying for if you think through it, if you prepare, as Tiffany mentioned. Look at what the job skills are required, think about what you've done, and then think about how you're going to sell what you've done in the past in relation to those new skills that are being expected of you.
Yeah, I think it's oftentimes articulating that connection, right? And that is part of the storytelling process. That, you know, thinking about how what you've done, the experiences you've had can connect and transfer, as you mentioned, and thinking about how you build that into part of that storytelling process. Absolutely. Tiffany, anything to add to that?
No, and I mean, I'd say just prepare, and because there's sometimes where, like, even if it's not a 1-for-1, like Dan said, you know, in the moment, the stressful moment of 3 strangers staring at you, if you're on a panel, like, you might not remember that, you know, yeah, that one difficult customer, like, it was, you know, really difficult in the moment, but I powered through it and these are the steps I took. Like, you might not even remember that story in that scenario to tell that story. So really just thinking back to, like, that stuff that, you know, maybe you stressed about, or maybe you celebrated because you did handle it. Writing that down, and that way will really help you just calm down in the moment and be able to tell that story very succinctly.
I also think, you know, to your point, sometimes as you continue to have experiences, sometimes it's difficult to file back to those in the moment. And especially when you're in a stressful moment, oftentimes maybe in an interview. And so obviously that preparation you talked about, Tiffany, is really, really valuable and important, sort of thinking about what the job entails and how you can connect your experiences and thinking about that ahead of time, really preparing that. But I think it's also maybe important that, you know, while an experience you're having might not be directly related to potentially what you're doing right now, there could be value in that in the future. And maybe having some time to regularly sort of reflect, maybe even record and actually write down experiences that you've had, ways that you've dealt with those, moved through those experiences, because they might be valuable to that story in the future. They might be transferable to something in the future. And so I think that's a really great point. So it makes it easier to file back to. Yeah.
Exactly. So I think he was my 3rd manager here. He only managed a team of 10, which I don't think it's not a lot, but come end of the year, he had to, like, start to prepare our performance review. And he told all of us, hey, I want a 1-pager, just a Word document of everything you accomplished in the year. And it could be as little or as big as you want it. And I sat at my computer October 1st, just staring at it like, I don't remember what I did in January. So from then on, I was like, I vow to never be blindsided in October to prepare for that. And so I start a file every January, and I have them going all the way back 21 years. And then I use those to prepare for my interview, because I'm like, yeah, I don't remember what I did in 2008 and what job I had and what project I led, or, you know, how that affected me as a person. But I have them, and so that helps me prepare. So yeah, document and then use that information to prepare. Oh, one last thing. I don't know if you're going to ask this. One key thing I always like to remind folks about interviewing is to prepare 3 to 5 questions to ask the panel. And I say 3 to 5 because some of them might get answered throughout your interview. But those questions are your way, as you ask the question, it's some of the questions you really don't want to really know the answer to, but you can, after they answer the question, you can have a follow-up to where you can say something you might have forgotten to say in the interview. So, like, for example, I don't know, what does success look like for this position within the first 90 days? And then they're going to answer it, which you probably will want to know the answer to that, so you can jot that down. And then you can say, okay, thanks. You know, every new position I've had, I strive to setting a 30, 60, 90-day plan. I always sit down with my manager the first week and I sketch out what that's going to look like. And that's really helped me, you know, chase that 90-day goal of what you guys are looking for in 90 days. So it kind of gives them another thing to remember about you, and you might have not have used it in any of the answers earlier in the interview. So be strategic in those questions.
You know, it's interesting. It is kind of it is a very vital and important part of a successful interview, that question portion, which you're almost always going to get, right? And I think it's also an excellent way. I think, you know, Dan talked about how storytelling builds that connection, and the ability to build that connection oftentimes makes you stand out. But I also think this is another way to build connection through the questions that you ask, and oftentimes asking questions about that person's story, giving them an opportunity to talk about their story, to maybe talk about what brought them to the company that you're interviewing at, what inspires them about their role. People do love to share their personal story, and oftentimes giving them the opportunity to do that builds connection as well. And so I think storytelling can come into play sort of in a different way, right? It's maybe not necessarily your storytelling, but providing the opportunity for your interviewer to share their story can oftentimes build that connection as well. Dan, anything else to add in that space?
No, I'm thinking about, you know, all the different experiences that I've had, mostly being on hiring panels, and how somebody does stand out by the questions that they ask. You know, you get a real sense of their own critical thinking, you know, what's important to them. You know, if the one question is, how much time off am I going to get, or am I going to be done by 5 o'clock every day? I learned about them something that I need to know as the hiring manager, where, you know, if they ask really thoughtful questions that show that they've done some research, that they're engaged in what we do and care about it. And I'm also thinking about, you know, you did a good job in this panel of picking two very different individuals. So I can tell that Tiffany is, like, you know, very buttoned up. She keeps good notes. She's very organized. I'm a disaster. I'm a creative type. And I am more likely to wing it, but I also prepare when I go into an interview so that I can wing whatever stories I want to tell, but I've thought about the stories in advance, and thought about how they relate to, you know, the job that's being asked.
You gave me too much credit, Dan.
But I actually think, to your point, oftentimes the preparation has a big impact on our presentation, and our preparation and our presentation often do tell a story themselves too, right? And so thinking about those pieces and how that really showcases and sort of talks about who you are, or demonstrates who you are, also affects that story. So I know we are coming to the end of our time. I probably could carry on this conversation for another 2 hours, picking your all's brain, because I know you have both had really accomplished careers and had a lot of experience being the storyteller and being on the receiving end of those stories, and how that's impacted your engagement with others. But any final thoughts before we wrap up that you feel are important to share with this group? Dan, I'll shoot it to you first.
Look at that. We just talked about how you should have some great question at the end to really hit things. And that is not anything I thought of in my preparation for this. One thing that I guess I'll make a little plug, the interview style that, so I again came from the broadcast industry, where we would bring people in, we would sit and chat with them, we would take them to lunch. They were usually coming from out of town, and so we might be spending 24 or 36 hours with them. So different from when you interview with the city, where it is a panel interview. The questions are scripted. We cannot veer from the questions. We can't ask follow-up questions. And when you're interviewing in that kind of style, which I think at government agencies in general, you're going to find that, and maybe some other places do it that way too, in the interest of, the goal is to try and be fair and consistent. The reality is it becomes much more challenging to tell that story. You have to be assertive and make the story that you want to tell fit the question, because they might not ask the question, or it might not just come up in the casual conversation. And so you have to prepare differently. So knowing what kind of style of interview you're going to go into, I think is really going to set you up for either success or failure if you don't know what that's going to look like.
Amazing point. Yes. Thank you, Dan. That's great. Tiffany, any quick final thoughts from you?
Yeah, so I would just urge everyone to take on the hard tasks. You're not going to grow by being average. By just coming into a job, having instructions or directions handed to you, having someone show you how to do it, and just really doing that day to day is not going to help you stand out. Just like coming to class every day, taking notes, getting A's on tests. Your peers and your competitors are among you, right? And the same goes for once you're in the workplace. And it's not always just about competition, but it's just more about evolving yourself. I had caught a little bit about Jonathan at the end there, and Abby was talking about, what your story becomes to help shape your story. It's really overcoming those challenges. So have patience with yourself, but definitely take solace that when you are in a role or a tough project or a really hard test you're cramming for, that is where you're gonna learn and you're gonna grow from that, and that will make your story that much better. So good luck to everyone out there. I hope to see you in the future on site.
Awesome. Well, I will just say a huge thank you to both Tiffany and Dan. I learned a lot, and I think all good things that you shared, great reminders and great ideas to really think about how we incorporate storytelling and the value that really plays in our career journey, in the interview process and our career growth. So thank you so very much. I am going to actually toss it back to Miss Abby Anderson to wrap us up.
Thanks so much, Amy. Oh, sorry, Tiffany. Real quick, Tiffany and Dan, we did have another question that popped up just asking, can our working learners, the students that are in attendance today, can they connect with y'all on LinkedIn? Yes?
Please, yes, would love to.
Yay!
Of course. I'm kind of popular on LinkedIn, so just letting you know if you haven't
Tiffany
followed
is kind
me
of
already.
popular on LinkedIn. All right. Well, thank you again. Thank you, Amy, for leading such a great conversation. Thank you again to Jonathan, Dan, and Tiffany for being able to join us today and giving all of your insights. This does bring us to the end of this year's fall conference. Thank you all in the audience for tuning in with us today. I know I learned some new tips and viewpoints on different ways to tell my story. I hope you all were able to take some things away too. As always, though, the WorkPlus office is here to support you all. If you ever need anything, or if you want to share your story with us, please don't hesitate to contact us or stop by our office on the Tempe campus. But with that being said, thank you all again. Have a great rest of your WorkPlus Wednesday, and we'll talk soon.